On the morning of the ceremony, my grandson laughed and said, "You're just Grandpa. Nobody's here for you." The words didn't sting right away. They landed softly, like snow on the back of your neck, cold but quiet. The kind of cold that seeps in only later, when you're alone. He didn't mean it to be cruel, I know. He's young. He hasn't learned yet how small words can carry heavy truths. But I had lived long enough to know when someone was only saying out loud what everyone else was already thinking. In my family, just Grandpa was more than a phrase. It was my role, my costume, my cage, the driver, the errand runner, the man who paid for things but never signed the card, the one who fixed the fence, replaced the porch light, mowed the lawn, and then slipped away before the photos were taken. I was the keeper of other people's comfort, and in exchange, I was invisible. I'd perfected the performance. I smiled at the right moments, kept my opinions short, and never demanded more space than I was given. At birthdays, I stood in the back with the trash bag, collecting torn wrapping paper while others laughed in the kitchen. At Christmas, I handed out gifts I'd bought, but let others put their names on the tags. My name had become something that lived only on bills, not in conversations. But inside me, something had been shifting. Not fast, not loud, more like a hairline crack in a pane of glass that no one notices at first. It had started years ago, the day I realized my family loved the idea of me, but not the truth of me. They loved that I was dependable, not that I was human. They loved that I didn't take up too much space, didn't complicate their plans, didn't require them to see me as anything more than a background figure in their busy, important lives. The car ride to the event was no different. They piled in, chattering about the program, who they might meet, which photos would get the most likes online. I was handed the camera bag and a thermos of hot chocolate for the kids. The front seat went to my son, the middle row to my daughter-in-law and the grandkids. I took the last seat in the back, squeezed between the coats, half turned so my knees wouldn't hit the stroller wedged in beside me. No one asked me if I was excited. No one told me who the guest speaker was or why this event mattered so much. I was cargo. Necessary but not celebrated. The man who would hold things, keep watch, and stay out of the way. As the city skyline appeared, silver and sharp against the winter sky, my eyes drifted to the tall glass building ahead. The venue. Sunlight bounced off its surface, throwing long beams across the street. In the reflection, I saw our car crawling forward, packed with people who had no idea that the man they'd labeled just Grandpa was carrying a piece of history inside him, a memory that could change the meaning of this entire day. In my coat pocket was a folded envelope, its edges soft from years of being handled. Inside was a photograph, a skinny young man with tired eyes, standing in front of a crumbling brick building. Next to him, a much younger version of me, my hand on his shoulder. Behind us, a sign that read, "Community Shelter." And tucked into that same envelope, a letter in handwriting that had long since faded, thanking me for a small act that, for him, had meant survival. I hadn't taken it out in years, but this morning, something told me to carry it. Something told me that perhaps today, the shadows I'd been living in might not be enough to hide me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't know if I wanted them to. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments. Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? If you feel connected to this story, please consider subscribing and sharing this video. That's how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. Now, let's continue. When we arrived, the air outside the venue had that heavy, electric quality, the kind that makes people stand a little taller, straighten their jackets, and scan the crowd for someone more important than themselves. The front steps were lined with banners in deep blues and golds, rippling in the winter wind, announcing the ceremony as if it were the kind of event history might remember. People milled about in clusters, their laughter sharp and bright, the kind of laughter meant to be overheard. Camera flashes flared in bursts, each one briefly freezing a face in perfect, rehearsed joy before releasing it back into motion. I walked behind my family, pushing the stroller over the uneven stone path. The cold seeped up through my shoes, but I said nothing. My son strode ahead with the confidence of someone who belonged. My daughter-in-law walked beside him, chin high, Her scarf nodded in a way that suggested she had practiced it. The grandkids darted around them, drawn toward the bustle, their excitement pure in a way only children's excitement can be. I stayed a pace behind, the stroller my silent tether. At the entrance, a line formed beneath a large glass awning. To the side, a long table held neatly arranged name cards in alphabetical order, each one printed in crisp black letters on heavy stock. Guests approached, found their names, and tucked the cards into the holders clipped to their lapels. The name cards caught the light, like tiny flags, marking territory in a room they had not yet entered. When my family reached the table, the usher greeted them with the kind of warmth that comes easily to people who know you're supposed to be there. My son and daughter-in-law each plucked their cards from the rows. Even the children had cards, their names printed smaller but still there, still recognized. Then it was my turn. I stepped forward, scanning the rows, the letters swimming slightly as my breath fogged my glasses. I moved slowly from A to Z, searching for my name, though I already felt the truth settling like a stone in my chest. It wasn't there. No one said anything at first. My son's smile dimmed but didn't disappear. He glanced over his shoulder at the crowd, as if hoping the moment would dissolve before anyone else noticed. My daughter-in-law adjusted the strap on her purse and began talking to one of the ushers about something else entirely, her voice just a shade too bright. I pretended to check another row, though my fingers no longer felt steady. The usher offered a polite, rehearsed smile. "Perhaps you're on the guest list without a card," he suggested, already turning to greet the next person. And that was it. The quiet erasure, the way a name can be missing and yet no alarm is raised, no correction made. Just a small hole in the fabric of the evening where you were supposed to be. Inside, the lobby was alive with light. Tall arrangements of winter flowers stood in crystal vases. Waiters moved silently with trays of sparkling drinks, the glasses chiming gently when they met. People hugged, exchanged business cards, and spoke in tones that were just loud enough to be overheard by those they wanted to impress. I followed my family through the crowd, still holding the stroller, still nameless. Every few steps they stopped to greet someone, introducing each other with careful titles and glowing descriptions. When they reached me, the introductions faltered. Sometimes I was simply Dad, other times this is our grandpa, but always without elaboration, without the small additions that tell a listener why someone matters. The words slid past like a placeholder, a courtesy before moving on to someone more relevant. The truth was simple. I had not been invited for me. I was there because my hands could hold a stroller and my presence could keep the children in line. My seat in this night was borrowed, a convenience, not an honor. And yet I moved through the space quietly, seeing everything, the way someone sees more when no one is looking back at them. I noticed the way the cameras circled certain people as if orbiting a light source. I noticed the small nods between men in dark suits, the quick adjustments of cufflinks before stepping into a photograph. I noticed, too, the absence of my own reflection in this curated world, how I passed behind the angles of the cameras, never through them, my story invisible against the glare of everyone else's. But in my pocket the envelope shifted as I walked, a faint reminder that the light in this room was not the only light that could matter. We had just stepped into the main hall, and the space itself seemed designed to remind certain people that they mattered, and others that they did not. The ceiling soared high above, draped with cascading lights like strands of frozen rain. Rows of chairs curved in precise arcs toward the stage, their polished wood catching the warm glow from overhead fixtures. The stage itself stood slightly elevated, wrapped in deep velvet curtains the color of old wine, with a sleek podium at its center, and a giant screen ready to magnify the faces of whoever spoke there. My family moved toward the rows closest to the front, their name cards guiding them to a cluster of reserved seats. The usher led us down the center aisle, and for a brief, almost dangerous second, I thought perhaps they had saved a place for me among them. But when we reached the third row, my son turned to me, his voice low and casual, the kind of tone people use when they want a command to sound like kindness. "Dad, maybe stay back a bit," he said. "You'll see better from farther away." It might have passed without injury, just another small nudge to the sidelines. But then my grandson, the same boy who had told me I was just Grandpa that morning, grinned and added his own twist. "Yeah, Grandpa, don't go near the stage. You'll embarrass us." The words were light for them, tossed like pebbles into a pond. But for me they landed heavy. Not because they were cruel. Cruelty at least admits you exist. No. These words carried something sharper. The quiet certainty that I didn't belong in the story unfolding here, that my place was in the shadows, where my absence wouldn't disrupt their picture. I felt the muscles in my face arrange themselves into that familiar practice smile, the one I had worn for decades to keep the peace, to smooth over awkward truths, to make my own diminishing seem like choice. I nodded, said nothing, and stepped back, my shoes sinking slightly into the plush carpet as I retreated toward the middle rows. From there, I could see the stage perfectly, though the distance felt deliberate, a measured space between the life I had lived and the recognition that life had never received. I let my gaze sweep across the audience as they settled in, noting each face, the way people leaned toward one another in quiet anticipation. I memorized the faces of my family, too, my son's easy posture, my daughter-in-law's polite half-smile, my grandson's restless shifting in his chair. I wanted to remember them exactly as they were in that moment, unaware, untouched, unknowing. The murmur of voices swelled and then quieted as the lights dimmed. Music rose softly from hidden speakers, a slow, deliberate melody that felt like the opening to a long-told tale. On the screen above the stage, images began to flicker, moments from the city's history, faces from decades past, scenes of people working together, building something out of nothing. The crowd leaned in, their attention caught, their hearts perhaps stirred by the careful rhythm of the story. I sat very still, the envelope in my pocket pressing against my side like a heartbeat. I could feel its weight as if it were more than paper, as if it were the key to a door no one here knew existed. And somewhere inside me a thought began to grow, slow and steady. There would come a moment tonight when stepping back would no longer be an option. I didn't yet know when that moment would arrive, but I knew this. When it did, I would not be smiling. The program moved forward in a slow, ceremonial rhythm, speakers stepping up to the podium, delivering carefully measured words that floated through the hall like polished stones, smooth and harmless. Applause rose and fell in predictable waves, warm but distant, the kind of applause that fills space without touching anything deep. I listened without really hearing, my focus turned inward to the quiet weight in my coat pocket. The envelope had been there so long it felt like part of the fabric. I had folded and refolded it so many times over the years that the creases were permanent, the paper worn thin in places. The once white edges had softened to the color of old bone. I could trace every corner in my mind without looking, the way the flap curved slightly from being opened more often than it should, the faint roughness where a drop of coffee had dried decades ago. Inside, the photograph lived like a pressed leaf, its colors faded, but its truth untouched. In it, I was younger, standing in a winter coat that had seen too many seasons, my arm draped over the thin shoulders of a boy who could not have been more than 17. His eyes were sharp but tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying burdens too heavy for a frame that slight. Behind us, the brick wall of the shelter leaned under the weight of its own years, its doorway a mouth open to the cold. And yet, in that frozen moment, we both looked as if we believed in something. Him in his own survival, me in the simple act of making it possible. Tucked behind the photo was the letter. The handwriting, once dark, had faded into a soft gray, each stroke thinner, like the memory of a voice. The paper itself had gone fragile, almost translucent, and when I held it up to the light, I could see the faint shadow of the words from the other side. It wasn't long, just a page, but every line carried weight. He had written to thank me for giving him a chance when no one else would. Not for saving him, he was clear about that, but for seeing him as someone worth saving in the first place. I had never shown it to my family, not because I wanted to keep it from them, but because it had never felt like their story to tell. It was not a thing to parade, not something for applause or photographs or speeches. It was a moment meant for the private ledger of the soul, the kind where you don't record wins or losses, only the truth of what you gave and what it cost you to give it. Over the years, I had carried that envelope through moves, through losses, through every stage of becoming the man they now called just Grandpa. It was my quiet archive, my reminder that even if the world forgot, even if my own family never knew, there was a time I had stood exactly where I needed to stand, and it had mattered. Now, sitting in that hall, the music swelling and the lights shifting toward the next speaker, I could feel the presence of that moment pressing against the present one. The boy in the photograph was no longer a boy, and the man I was then had aged into someone almost unrecognizable. But the thread between us had not broken, and as I slid my hand into my pocket, feeling the thin edges of the envelope, I wondered if tonight would be the night that thread was pulled into the open for everyone to see. I had not come here seeking recognition. My name wasn't printed, my seat wasn't marked, my presence wasn't planned, but sometimes the past arrives in the room before you do. And when it finally turns to look for you, you either stand or you let yourself disappear forever. The lights dimmed further, leaving only the soft glow on the stage, and the voice of the master of ceremonies deepened as if even he understood the gravity of the next moment. He paused just long enough to let the anticipation swell, the air in the hall thickening until every ear strained forward. Then he spoke the words that sent a ripple through the audience. "Tonight we are honored to welcome a very special guest, a man whose voice is known across this country, whose story has inspired thousands, whose journey stands as a testament to resilience and hope." The reaction was immediate. A low murmur spread like a current through the seats. Heads turned, some in recognition, others in eager curiosity. I could see people leaning toward one another, exchanging quick, reverent phrases. A legend, a hero, a man who had risen from nothing to stand among the most celebrated. It was the kind of introduction that built a stage before the man even stepped onto it, the kind that wrapped him in a crown of expectation. And then he appeared. He didn't hurry, didn't stride in with the overconfidence of someone accustomed to applause. His pace was deliberate, almost measured, as though each step had weight. The spotlight found him, and in its circle he seemed taller, not in stature but in presence. His shoulders carried the years, but not the years alone. They carried battles won quietly, losses endured without spectacle, victories claimed without need for an audience. The applause rose sharp and bright, but I barely heard it, because the moment I saw the way he moved, the slight forward tilt of his head, the careful placement of each foot, recognition struck like the clear toll of a bell. It was not his fame that reached me first, not the layers of his public story, but something older, more personal. I knew that walk. I had seen it long before the cameras, before the speeches, before the suits and the polished shoes. It was the same walk I had once watched approach me on a frozen morning outside the shelter. A boy then, wearing a coat too thin for the cold, shoes worn down at the heels, but carrying himself with the stubborn dignity of someone who refused to fold. I remembered the way he had stood in that doorway, silent at first, as if unsure whether the world would welcome him or turn him away. I remembered placing a hand on his shoulder, the silent promise in that touch. You are not invisible here. Now, decades later, that same gate moved across a stage before hundreds of eyes. But I saw past the man he had become to the boy he had been, the one who had once written me a letter in faded ink. He reached the podium and rested his hands on its edges. The applause softened into silence. He looked out at the audience with an expression that seemed to take in more than just the faces in front of him. For a brief moment, his gaze swept across the rows, and I felt that he was searching. And as I sat there, nameless among the middle seats, the envelope pressing against my side like a heartbeat, I knew he would find me. Not yet, but soon. Just as the applause for the guest began to fade, my son leaned toward me, his hand resting lightly on the back of my chair. The pressure was gentle, but the intent was firm, a nudge, not a request. He gestured toward a seat farther back, tucked behind one of the great marble columns that lined the hall. "It might be more comfortable here," he murmured, his voice carrying that quiet finality of someone who has already decided for you. I looked at the seat. From there, the stage would be partially hidden, the sightline broken by the thick curve of the column. It was the kind of spot you give to latecomers or people who aren't expected to matter in the proceedings. There was no reserved sign, no name card. Just a chair at the edge of things, placed where it wouldn't interrupt the perfect symmetry of the front rows. I moved without argument, my footsteps slow, the plush carpet muting the sound. The air shifted as I passed through clusters of people, their conversations folding over me like water over a stone. I could feel my son's relief behind me, not relief that I would be more comfortable, but that I would be less visible. The chair by the column was cool against my back when I sat down. From here I could see only half the stage. The other half vanished behind the stone, like a torn photograph. I adjusted myself to catch glimpses between the curves, tilting my head slightly in the practiced way of someone used to seeing life through the spaces left open for them. In front of me, my granddaughter raised her phone, her bright screen cutting through the dimmed light of the hall. She was recording a short video, capturing the stage, the audience, the moment. When she turned briefly to film the family, her camera caught me only in passing, the edge of my shoulder, the blur of my sleeve, before swinging away as if I were a detail to be cropped out later. Her friends online would see the occasion in polished fragments, the speeches, the flowers, the shining faces. I would be no more than background noise in those frames, a silent placeholder for someone who had been there but not worth noting. It was a small thing, a tiny omission, a single choice about where to place a chair, how to frame a lens. But small things accumulate. They stack quietly in the corners of a life until one day you find yourself boxed in by them, surrounded by the evidence that you have been gently, persistently moved out of the light. I sat there, half in shadow, watching as the guest on stage spoke about struggle and triumph, about those who had helped him along the way. The crowd listened as though the words themselves were gifts, nodding in the kind of shared reverence that feels like belonging. And I, still and unseen, kept one hand in my coat pocket, my fingers brushing the soft, worn edges of the envelope. It reminded me that history doesn't need permission to exist. The truth of what happened, of who helped and who turned away, of who stood beside you when no one else would, it doesn't vanish because you've been seated behind a column. Sometimes the truth waits patiently, knowing that sooner or later someone will have to face it in the light. I didn't know yet if that moment would come tonight, but the way the man on stage kept glancing toward the back of the hall made me think he was searching for someone, and that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't stop until he found me. The man at the podium let the applause settle before speaking again, and when he did, his voice carried a weight that silenced the last stray whispers in the room. It was the voice of someone who had walked through darkness and learned how to make his words carry light. He didn't start with his own achievements. Instead, he began with a story, not his full story, but the foundation beneath it, the kind of beginning most people like to smooth over once they've reached the summit. He spoke of nights when he had nothing, of mornings when waking up meant facing the same hunger as the day before, of doors that stayed closed, of voices that told him, gently or otherwise, that he should expect nothing better. And then, he said, there had been a moment when someone, somewhere, had chosen to believe in him before he had the means to prove he was worth believing in. He paused, letting the sentence hang in the air. Then he spoke of unseen hands, the kind that lift the world quietly, without ever stepping into the frame. He said those hands belong to people who never ask for thanks, who never hold up a receipt for the debts they've covered, people whose kindness doesn't have an audience, whose help is the kind that leaves no fingerprints except on the heart of the one who receives it. The words worked their way into me, and before I could stop it, my own memory opened like a door I'd been leaning against for years. I could see the nights as clearly as if I'd just left them, the freezing air stinging my face, the heavy cardboard boxes digging into my arms, my breath clouding in the dark as I carried load after load into the shelter's back room. Medicines, blankets, canned goods. The relief in the eyes of the tired volunteers when they saw the supplies. The way the boy himself, younger, thinner, more silent than the man now speaking, had stood off to the side, watching, unsure if he was allowed to believe any of it was for him. Those nights had been cold, and not just in temperature. They were the kind of nights that tested the edges of your resolve, the kind where exhaustion threatened to push you toward indifference. But I had kept coming back, not because it made me feel noble, but because I couldn't stand the thought of turning my back on someone who still had a chance. In the hall now, his voice deepened. He spoke of a single gesture that had turned the tide for him, a moment when the path forward had been nothing more than a narrow strip of ice, and someone had laid down a plank so he could cross. He didn't give names. He didn't yet say when or where, but I knew. Every word was a brushstroke painting a picture I had lived in. My fingers curled slightly in my pocket, pressing into the worn paper of the envelope until I could feel the edges against my skin. It was as if the photograph and the letter inside were reacting to the sound of his voice, as if they knew the air was carrying their story now, whether the world recognized it or not. Around me, people leaned in, captivated by the image he was building with his words. They heard a fable of generosity and perseverance. I heard the truth, not in the polished phrasing, but in the unspoken details he left between the lines. I could hear the wind on those nights, feel the sting in my hands, smell the damp cement of the shelter floor. And as I sat there, half hidden behind the column, I began to understand something. He wasn't just telling his story, he was slowly, carefully, building a bridge back to mine. The story on stage had reached its crest, and with it, the room seemed to lean forward as one body. Applause broke out, sharp, sustained, and proud. But it washed past me like water around a stone. I clapped too, because that is what you do when the world tells you to. But my hands moved slowly, without the fever that burned in the others. I wasn't applauding the version of the story they heard. I was hearing something else entirely. The man at the podium stepped aside, and the great screen above him came to life. Its light spilled over the audience, bleaching faces into pale ovals. Grainy black and white footage flickered into view, a montage of his early years. The images carried the texture of old film. Dust scratches, sudden flares, shadows too deep to reveal what they held. There was the shelter in winter, its brick wall uneven and chipped, the narrow doorway framed in rusted metal. And then the frame changed, and I saw it, a frozen moment I knew by heart. The boy, thin-shouldered, standing in the doorway, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a coat too small for him. Next to him, a man in an old wool overcoat, the collar turned up against the wind, his hair caught mid-gust. My own face, younger, unlined, the weight of the years still ahead of me. For an instant, the air in the hall seemed to thin, as if the room had forgotten how to breathe. I could feel it, that silent recognition tugging at the edges of attention. Somewhere behind me, a voice, low but not low enough, whispered, "That looks like our grandpa." It was said not with certainty, but with that half-laugh people use when they don't expect agreement. Another voice, sharper, amused, followed quickly. "Come on, no way!" And just like that, the thread snapped. Laughter, soft, but enough to cut through me, returned the moment to the safe distance of a coincidence. I sat completely still, my gaze fixed on the screen, as if not moving could somehow hold the image in place longer. The clip was only a few seconds. The boy shifting his weight, me glancing toward someone outside the frame, before it dissolved into another scene, another step in the man's journey. But I knew what I had seen. I knew the truth of that day, the sting of the wind, the heaviness of the box I had just set down at his feet. I knew the feeling of his shoulder under my hand. And I knew that the picture, once shown, could not be unseen. Not by me, and not by him. Around me, the applause rose again as the video ended, but it was applause for a story that had been sanded smooth, the edges filed down to fit the evening's narrative. The part where the man on stage had been just a boy, and I had been the stranger who stopped long enough to change something in him, that part wasn't labeled. It wasn't explained. It simply flickered across the screen and disappeared, like a secret slipping back into shadow. And yet I could tell. He had seen it too. From where I sat, hidden by the column, I could feel his gaze sweep the crowd, pausing for a heartbeat too long on the rows behind the front. The searching was no longer subtle. It was as though the image had pulled a thread inside him that he could not ignore. I didn't move, not yet. The silence after the video was different from the silences that had come before. It wasn't just the polite pause between applause and the next part of the program. It had weight, a subtle strain, like the stillness in the air before a storm breaks. The man on stage adjusted the microphone, but his eyes weren't on it. They were still scanning the audience, slower now, deliberate, as though each row might hold the answer to something he hadn't realized he'd been searching for until tonight. I felt the shift inside me before I felt it around me. My hand was still in my pocket, fingers pressing the envelope, the photograph and letter like two small, silent witnesses. The weight of them wasn't heavy in grams. It was heavy in years. Heavy in all the times I had stayed seated, stayed quiet, stayed small to make it easier for everyone else. That's when I heard it. My son's voice, low but sharp, slicing into the moment like a blade. "Don't you dare stand up." He didn't need to explain. I knew what he meant. Don't bring attention. Don't make this about you. Don't disrupt the clean, polished version of the evening. For a second, my body obeyed out of habit. My back stayed pressed against the chair, my gaze fixed on the stage from behind the safe obstruction of the column. My breathing was shallow, the way it gets when you are holding yourself inside an invisible frame someone else has drawn for you. But then, something in me, something older than his authority, older than his voice, began to move. It rose from deep in the spine, from a place where memories are stored in the bones themselves. I remembered other moments when I'd been told to wait, to stay back, to let others step forward in my place. I remembered the boy in the photograph, the look in his eyes when I had stood beside him in the doorway, solid and unflinching, when he had no one else to lean on. I remembered what it meant to stand up, not for recognition, but for truth. And so, without a word, I pushed my hands against the arms of the chair and rose. The movement was slow but deliberate, the kind that made people glance over even if they didn't know why. My knees straightened, my back found its full height, and for the first time in a long time, I let my posture claim its own space. I didn't stand for the stage. I didn't stand for the cameras. I stood because my own spine remembered what it was like to be straight, to be a man who did not fold himself smaller to fit the comfort of others. From my new vantage point, I could see the stage clearly. No marble cutting the view in half. The man at the podium saw me too. Our eyes caught and held for a moment longer than was comfortable for anyone watching. Something passed there. Not a smile, not a nod, but a kind of recognition that exists beneath words. The room hadn't changed. The program hadn't paused. But for me, the air was different now. The years of quiet had begun to crack, and through those cracks, something unyielding was beginning to push its way to the surface. The guest at the podium adjusted his stance, leaning slightly forward as though the microphone were no longer his anchor, but merely an obstacle between him and someone in the crowd. His eyes were not scanning now. They were fixed, the way a person fixes on a shoreline after drifting too long in open water. His hand lifted from the edge of the lectern, fingers curling slightly as if catching the pull of a memory he could no longer ignore. The hall was still, the kind of stillness that carries its own sound, the faint hum of the lights, the almost imperceptible shifting of bodies and seats, the collective holding of breath. His chest rose, and when he spoke, his voice had changed. It was lower, steadier, but edged with something raw. "He's here," he said. It was not the kind of line that fit neatly into a speech. It broke the rhythm, tore a seam in the fabric of the evening's rehearsed order, and it landed differently in each part of the room. In the front rows, heads turned toward one another, confusion in their eyes. In the aisles, ushers froze, mid-step. Somewhere behind me, someone whispered, "Who?" But I knew. He didn't point toward the polished boxes of the dignitaries, nor toward the clusters of local officials and invited elites whose names were printed in the program in bold type. His arm extended instead toward the far side of the hall, past the neat arcs of reserved seating, toward the section where chairs were simply placed, unmarked, unimportant, toward the rows where I stood, behind a column only minutes ago, in a place meant for overflow and afterthoughts. And then he stepped away from the podium. The stage lights tried to follow him, but lagged, as though reluctant to leave their fixed circle. He moved deliberately down the steps, ignoring the polite hand of the MC, who seemed ready to guide him back into place. The applause that had risen instinctively when he moved off stage began to falter, replaced by a ripple of confusion. It was not the kind of movement audiences were trained to expect. This was unscripted, unplanned, a deviation from the safe path. His eyes never left mine. The distance between us was still wide, a gulf filled with years neither of us had named aloud. But each step he took was closing it. And with every one, the years between the boy in the doorway and the man crossing the hall collapsed a little more. I stood still. I could feel the heat of hundreds of eyes shifting toward me now, following the line of his approach, some curious, some puzzled, a few openly questioning why the guest of the evening would leave the stage for someone in the shadows. My son's hand brushed my arm in a quiet attempt to draw me back into my seat, but I didn't move. He kept walking, past the front rows, past the angled chairs of the midsection, past people who had stood to greet him but were left with only the air between them as he passed. Every step brought him closer to the section where name cards didn't matter, where no one expected the evening's light to reach. I could feel my heart in my throat, not from fear, but from the strange gravity of being seen, truly seen, after so many years of being easy to overlook. When he reached the first row of my section, he slowed, scanning until his gaze locked again with mine. And in that look there was no hesitation, no question, only the certainty of someone who has finally found what they were searching for. He reached me without slowing, without glancing at the curious faces on either side. The lights followed now, late but insistent, spilling over the section that had been in shadow all evening. I could feel the sudden heat of them on my shoulders, a warmth I hadn't asked for, a light I had long since learned to live without. And then, without ceremony, without any of the polite hesitation that so often robs an embrace of its truth, his arms were around me. It wasn't the brief, polite hug of acquaintances. It was the kind of embrace that belongs to people who have both stood in storms and survived them, the kind where each understands without a word the weight the other has carried. His arms were strong, but there was nothing performative in the strength. It was a holding on, not a holding up. The kind of contact that says, I remember. I am here because of you. My own arms rose slowly, almost awkwardly, as if they'd forgotten the way back to this kind of closeness. For a moment, the years fell away, and I was back in the freezing air outside the shelter, my hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremor of someone still learning what it was to be safe. Only now it was me who felt the tremor, not of fear, but of the strange, almost painful relief that comes when a truth you've carried in silence is finally recognized in the open. I heard him speak, low and certain. His voice meant only for me, but carried in a tone that seemed to anchor the whole room. You're the one. Just 3 words, but they pressed into me like a seal. Not a title, not a compliment, a fact. And in those words was the admission that the boy in the photograph and the man in front of me were bound by something unshakable, something no years or distances or silences had erased. The room reacted in a way I will never forget. The applause that had been scattered and confused when he first stepped off the stage had stopped completely. What replaced it was a hush so complete it felt like the air itself had thickened. Not awkward, not impatient, but reverent. The kind of silence that falls in the presence of something too real to interrupt. It spread over the hall like snowfall, softening edges, making every sound sharper in its absence. I could feel the eyes on us, hundreds of them, but for once they did not feel like spotlights. They felt like witnesses. People were leaning forward, trying to understand, sensing that they were watching something unplanned, something unpolished, something that could not be staged. In that moment, the invisible line between the front rows and the back dissolved. The marble column that had blocked me minutes ago might as well have been dust. We stayed like that longer than would have fit into any formal schedule. When we finally pulled back, his hands stayed on my shoulders, his gaze holding mine with a steadiness that made it impossible to look away. And for the first time that night, I did not feel like a man out of place. I felt like a man exactly where he was supposed to be. He didn't return to the podium right away. Instead, he kept one hand on my shoulder, as if letting go too soon would break the fragile bridge that had just been rebuilt between us. When he finally turned toward the audience, his voice didn't rise to fill the hall the way it had before. It dropped lower, steadier, but somehow carried farther, as though the quiet itself was helping it travel. "There's something you don't know," he began. "Something that's been missing from every version of my story you've ever heard." He glanced back at me once, not for approval, but in a way that told me he intended to carry the truth properly this time. Then he faced the crowd again, the faces leaning forward, drawn in by the break from the script. He spoke of a winter when he was 17, when every day felt like an uphill climb on ice. Of sleeping in places meant for storage, not for people. Of days when he walked the city in shoes so worn they let the cold in with every step. Of a letter he had tried to write to a shelter asking for help, and the silence that came back. Then he said there had been a man he barely knew, who had no reason to risk time, money, or energy on him, but who did. He told them how I paid for his first month in a room with heat, no questions asked. How I had driven across the city late at night to bring him a pair of boots lined with real wool, so his feet would stop going numb. How I had signed my name to a letter of recommendation that opened doors which had, until that moment, been bolted shut. The hall was silent, except for his voice. Not a shuffle of papers, not a cough. Even the children in the audience seemed to sense that this was a moment that required stillness. He lifted his hand toward the massive screen behind him, and a new image filled it. My signature, in the looping, careful handwriting of my younger self, stretched large across the backdrop. Ink that had once dried in the corner of a kitchen table was now 10 feet high, lit by stage lights. At home, that same signature sat in a folder at the back of a desk drawer, untouched for years, forgotten in the noise of daily life, buried under bills and lists and things deemed more urgent. Yet here, in front of a room full of strangers and my own family, it was no longer forgotten. It was proof. Proof that my presence in this man's story wasn't an accident, wasn't a coincidence, wasn't a favor so small it could be filed away and left to fade. I didn't move. I couldn't. It felt as though every breath I'd held in over the years was pressing at once against my ribs. My name had not been on the seating chart, not on the program, not even on a folded card in the front row. But it was here now, larger than life, impossible to overlook. And for the first time in decades, I felt the shape of my own name in the air again. Not as a signature on a forgotten page, but as something spoken, carried, and finally set where it belonged. The request came not as a command, but as a ripple moving through the organizers at the side of the hall. One of them stepped forward, speaking into a headset. Then another leaned toward me, their voice careful, almost hesitant. Would I come to the stage? The words were framed politely, but the tone carried that undercurrent of urgency, the kind people use when they realize they've overlooked something important and are trying to make up for it without admitting the oversight. For a moment, I stayed still. I had been asked to wait in corridors all my life, in hospitals, in offices, in homes where I was welcome to work but not to sit, always close enough to help, but not to be seen. If the stage wanted me now, it could wait, not out of spite, but because I had learned the worth of my own pace. I let the moment stretch. The guest, still standing near me, didn't move either. He seemed to understand. The audience, sensing something unplanned was happening, stayed quiet. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was expectant, the way the air feels before the first drop of rain in a dry season. When I finally began to walk, it wasn't toward applause. Applause is quick. It dies the second the hands stop moving. I was walking toward something slower, heavier, honesty. A recognition not shouted into microphones but held in place like a truth you can't roll back once it's spoken. The aisle to the stage was longer than it looked from my seat. Each step passed rows of faces, some curious, some smiling, a few frowning as if still trying to place me. My family's eyes followed me too. My son's expression was caught between pride and something harder to name. My granddaughter's phone was in her lap now, the screen dark. For once she wasn't filming. When I reached the stairs to the stage, I paused, letting my hand rest on the cool rail. I remembered nights I'd climbed steps like these, carrying boxes of supplies into the shelter, my hands raw from the cold. Back then, the steps had led to dim rooms smelling of damp clothes and boiled coffee, not to a stage lit in gold. But the weight I carried now was the same, the knowledge that the smallest acts can take the longest to be seen. I climbed slowly, not milking the moment but giving it its due. Each step felt like it was undoing a little of the erasure I had lived with for years. The man at the podium stepped aside, making room for me without flourish or fanfare. He didn't guide me to a spot. He let me choose where to stand. And when I reached the center, I didn't look at the cameras or the screen or the rows of strangers. I looked at him, the boy I had once known, and then I let my gaze travel past him, over the audience, without rush or apology. I stood there, not as an accessory to his story, but as part of its foundation. A foundation finally brought into the light. No one spoke for a few beats. There was no need. Sometimes justice doesn't require a shout. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the shape of a man who has been told to wait his whole life, standing exactly where he belongs, without asking permission. From the stage, the crowd looked different. Faces that had seemed distant and abstract from my seat now appeared in sharp detail. Eyes, expressions, small shifts in posture. I could see the curiosity settling into understanding, the way whispers faded as people pieced together the story that had been unfolding around them without their knowing. But my attention wasn't on the strangers. It was on the familiar faces halfway down the hall. My son sat straighter than usual, his hands clasped too tightly in his lap. He wasn't smiling, and he wasn't clapping. His gaze stayed low, fixed on some invisible point on the floor. Every so often his shoulders moved, the subtle shift of someone trying to manage thoughts too heavy to hold still. Beside him, my granddaughter had lowered her phone, the bright rectangle of its screen now black against her knees. She wasn't scrolling, wasn't filming, wasn't sharing. For once she was simply watching, her head tilted just slightly, as if seeing me from a distance she hadn't realized existed until now. When the ceremony paused for the transition to the next segment, I stepped down from the stage. The path back to my seat was quieter than the one toward the podium. No one rushed to speak to me, but no one looked past me either. The air around me had shifted, not into celebration, but into recognition. I reached my row, and as I eased into my seat, my granddaughter leaned toward me. Her voice was low, uncertain, carrying the tone of someone asking a question they should have asked long ago. "Grandpa, why didn't you tell us?" I let the silence between her question and my answer breathe for a moment. The truth didn't need to be hurried. Then I said it simply, my eyes on the stage rather than her face. Because kindness isn't an announcement. It's either remembered or it's betrayed. The words weren't sharp, but they were heavy enough to settle between us. She looked down at her hands, her fingers worrying the edge of her phone case. My son still didn't look up. For years they had seen me as the man in the background, dependable, available, forgettable. Now, for the first time, they were forced to hold the picture of me as someone who had once changed the course of a life, and perhaps not just one. Around us the program continued. Applause rose and fell for others. Speeches wove their careful arcs. But at our seats, something quieter was happening. A pause that wasn't awkward but necessary. A pause in which the story they thought they knew was being rewritten in real time. And I knew it would not be finished tonight. Some truths take longer to settle, but the first crack had opened, and the light was finding its way in. The weeks after the ceremony moved at their own slow pace, as if the air around me had grown heavier with the weight of what had been revealed. For most of my life, events came and went without leaving much behind. Just photographs I wasn't in, stories I wasn't part of. But this time was different. This time the story had left something in its wake that couldn't be folded away in a drawer. I learned about the plaque only when the invitation arrived. Thick paper, heavier than it needed to be, with my name written in careful script. They were dedicating a section of the community center to the people who had made its existence possible. And not the quiet list in the back of a program, not a line on a spreadsheet, but something that would hang in the open, where every person who walked through the doors would see it. When I arrived, the hall felt different than it had the night of the ceremony. No banners, no television cameras, no carefully staged lighting. Just people, staff from the shelter, community members, faces that had weathered both hardship and hope. There was a kind of still joy in the air, a gentler current than the sharp applause of formal events. The guest, no, not the guest anymore, but the man I had once known as a boy, was already there, speaking quietly with a few volunteers. When he saw me, he didn't wave me over from a distance. He walked across the room with that same steady pace he'd had on stage weeks ago, and when he reached me, he wrapped me in an embrace again. But this one was different. The first had been a thank you, raw and immediate, pulled into the open by the sudden collision of past and present. This one was something quieter, deeper. It wasn't the embrace of a man repaying a debt. It was the embrace of a man greeting someone who had been family all along, even without the blood or the title to prove it. We stood together as they unveiled the plaque. The cloth fell away, and there it was. First benefactor. Beneath it, my name. The same loops and lines I had signed on that letter all those years ago, now carved into metal, the surface catching the light. My name was not bigger than anyone else's, not placed higher, not given more space. But it was there, fixed, permanent. The man spoke briefly to the gathered crowd, not about what I had given him, but about the kind of world he believed in, one where the smallest acts could change the shape of a life. He called me an example of that. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. My silence had carried this long. It could carry a little longer. When it was over, I returned to my family. I didn't stand taller than them, didn't demand their words, didn't expect apologies. I sat exactly where I belonged, not above them, not beneath them, but alongside them. And in that quiet I heard my granddaughter's voice, soft but sure. "This is our grandpa, the man who made all this possible." It was said without fanfare, without the defensive laugh people use when they're unsure of the truth. It was said the way you say a fact, plainly, because it needs no decoration. And in that moment, I understood that this was the ending that couldn't be rewritten, not because it was carved into metal, but because it had been carved into their memory. I had been just Grandpa for a long time, but now in their words and in their eyes I was exactly who I had always been, only this time they could see it.